Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. So in this video, I thought I would do something a little bit different. As of today, or at least when this video comes out, it will be the 5th of October 2022, which is 60 years to the day since the first official James Bond movie, Dr. No, was released in cinemas. And I thought to celebrate that, I would do an entire ranking of the James Bond franchise. The James Bond franchise has been a part of my life since as far as I can remember. I grew up with them, I love them, I still love them to this day. But like all James Bond fans, we all have our favourites and our least favourites. So yeah, I just thought I would give you mine from worst to best. This is just going to be a ranking of the official 25 James Bond movies, so I'm not going to be including the likes of Never Say Never Again or the original Casino Royale. It will just be the original Eon 25 movies. Just one thing to note as well, this is my personal ranking of the franchise. Please don't be offended if any of my opinions differ from yours. It's just my personal opinion, and like I said before, we all have our favourites and our least favourites, and if all of our opinions were the same, life wouldn't be as interesting. So yeah, this is just my personal ranking. So in 25th place, I'm going to have to go with 1971's Diamonds Are Forever, the last official Bond movie to star Sean Connery. So yeah, I have a lot of problems with this movie. The biggest one for me is that it just feels like a spoof. It doesn't feel like a serious Bond adventure. It feels more like I'm watching Austin Powers. Sean Connery was obviously enticed back to the role and was given a huge payday to star as James Bond again. And you can just tell from the screen that he's just doing it for the money. He just looks so bored, so disinterested. And yeah, that really doesn't rub well with me when I watch the movie. I don't like any of the other actors in it. I don't like Charles Gray as Blofeld. I think he's probably one of the weakest villains in the entire franchise. And there's just a general lack of suspense and excitement in this movie. There's very little like action scenes. I think the most notable one is probably the whole moon buggy sequence where James Bond, he finds himself on it's like a fake moon landing set and he escapes in this moon buggy. And again, it's just scenes like that just feel very spoof-like and hard to take serious. And yeah, other than that, it's just a lot of really silly moments that I just don't enjoy with this movie. The only time I enjoy watching this movie is when I watch it with friends and we point out all the really humorous moments in it. But other than that, I just don't get any enjoyment out of it whatsoever. So yeah, unfortunately, Diamonds Are Forever falls into last place. So in 24th place, I'm going to go with Die Another Day, the last Bond movie to star Pierce Brosnan. And yeah, this choice is probably not a surprise to many because I know many people consider this to be the absolute worst of the franchise, and it isn't hard to disagree with that. I do get some enjoyment out of it, mainly in the first half. I think the pre-title sequence is pretty good. Really fun action sequence in North Korea, I think it is. And then we have that whole scene in the prison, which I think is quite dark and borders on the sort of Daniel Craig territory. And I do really like that sort of first 20 minutes of the movie. But after that, it quickly descends into madness and we get too much CGI, too many over-the-top action sequences, a really bizarre plot, and just many other things that really bring the movie down. It was a very misguided attempt to do a 40th anniversary movie for the franchise, and I think the creators have even said that they got it wrong with Die Another Day. So yeah, I don't get much enjoyment when I come back to it, but like I said, there are some aspects I don't mind of the movie, but overall, it's not very good. So in 23rd place, I'm sadly going to have to go with another Pierce Brosnan movie, and that is 1999's The World Is Not Enough. So this movie is kind of the opposite of Die Another Day. It's not as over the top, it's not CGI heavy, but on the other hand, I just find this movie very bland and very boring, and I find the direction very uninspired, and it feels very almost like a TV movie. I guess you could say a big budget TV movie, but everything on the screen just feels very bland and it lacks a certain energy for me. The plot doesn't do anything for me. Pierce Brosnan is great in it. I do like Elektra. I think she's a pretty cool villain. Renard, on the other hand, he's just not really given enough to do. And yeah, sadly, it just doesn't work for me. I don't mind the movie. I can get some enjoyment out of it, but I very rarely come back to it because I just find it so bland and kind of tired in a way. Like I said, it is the complete opposite of Die Another Day, but almost a bit too much in the opposite direction. But yeah, sadly it has to fall into 23rd place. So in 22nd place, I'm going to go with 1974's The Man with the Golden Gun. Now, I know this movie does have a lot of fans, but for me, I've always kind of struggled with this movie. I again, like The World Is Not Enough, it feels very tired and very uninspired to me. I know when this movie came out, it came out in 1974, and up until that point, all of the Bond movies were being released on a yearly or 2-year average, which in this day and age is just completely crazy. Like, we'd be lucky to get a movie every 5 years, let alone 1 or 2 years. But having said that, when the movie had come out, there had been 9 films in 12 years, and I just think by the time they got to Man with the Golden Gun, the writers just ran out of ideas, because it does feel like they're kind of repeating themselves in places, and the action sequences are just not there. Like what I said with Diamonds Are Forever, there's just a general lack of excitement, action, and the plot just doesn't really do anything for me. I do like some of the locations, I like some of the characters, Scaramanga, Knick Knack, but I think Roger Moore, he's kind of playing against type in this movie, and it doesn't really work for him. And yeah, I just find this movie a bit of a struggle every time I watch it. I just find it quite hard to sit through, quite boring, if I'm being honest. Which is a shame, because I know a lot of people do really like this movie, but for me, it's not one of my favourites. So in 23rd place, I'm going to go with 2015's Specter, starring Daniel Craig. So again, there are aspects that I like of this movie. I think of all of Daniel Craig's movies, it probably feels the most like a classic Bond adventure. There's a lot of different countries he visits, there's some fun action sequences, there's larger-than-life villains, but this movie really lets itself down by that last act, when Christopher Waltz's character appears and the revelations of his relationship with Bond, and yeah, it really just falls apart from there. And even though it's only in the last act, it just completely drags the whole movie down for me. And I remember coming out of this movie and I was scratching my head. I just couldn't believe the direction it decided to take with the plot. I don't really want to spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen it, but yeah, it was a big disappointment for me, because up until that point, I thought the movie was pretty good. It is quite long in places and a bit slow, but you know, there are some fun moments here and there, but like I said, it's just that last act which just completely fails the movie for me, and that's why it has to go into 21st place. So in 20th place, I'm going to go with 2021's No Time to Die, which is obviously the most recent Bond movie we have had. So yeah, I've got to admit, I didn't have much excitement for this movie, especially after Spectre. My expectations were pretty low for it, and when I saw it, it was basically exactly what I thought it was going to be, sort of a finale to Daniel Craig's Bond story, if you like. The problem I have with the Daniel Craig movies is I don't like the sort of the soap opera overarching story that it takes throughout all 5 of his movies. I'm more of a classic Bond fan that likes each movie to be its own separate thing, and I just didn't like that direction that it took with Daniel Craig's movies. So when I came to this one, I just didn't really have much excitement for it. But as a movie on its own, I think it just suffers a lot of the same problems that Spectre does. It's very long, it's very slow in places, but the biggest issue I have is the villain. You've got Rami Malek in there, who is a fantastic actor, and I was really excited when they said he was going to be playing the villain in this movie, but he's barely in the film, and he barely does anything. And even when it gets to the end of the film, and his objective gets revealed, it's really hazy and really underwritten, and by the end of the movie, I just didn't really know what was going on. And yeah, because of that, I just didn't really have much excitement or suspense whilst I was watching it. And I know there's also the ending, which is very controversial. I won't reveal it to anyone who hasn't seen the movie, but it didn't really bother me. It was more just the rest of the movie. I wanted just a very strong, cohesive movie with a good narrative, but for me, No Time to Die doesn't really deliver that. I think the movie's fine, it's okay, but it's nowhere near one of the best Bond movies for me. And yeah, I was just more kind of relieved to see the movie and finally see Daniel Craig's tenure as Bond come to an end, because for anyone who knows me, you'll know that I'm not the biggest fan of Daniel Craig. But as a movie in itself, No Time to Die, I just thought it was okay. So in 19th place, I'm going to go with You Only Live Twice, starring Sean Connery. So yeah, this movie might be a contender for the very first Bond movie I ever saw. I have a lot of very distant early memories of watching this at my grandparents' house. And you'd think I'd have some kind of nostalgia for it, but when I watch this movie now, I don't really enjoy it. I think it's one of the classic Bond movies that has the villain with a huge lair and he has plans for world domination. And those types of Bond movies are not for me. I like the sort of the more subtle, more espionage-like Bond movies. And this one's just a bit too over the top. I don't mind it. I like some of the Japanese locations in it because I do like Japanese cinema. I like Japan as a country, so it's cool to see Bond going there. There are some fun moments, but again, it just kind of leans more into that campy, silly territory that we got in Diamonds Are Forever. So yeah, whenever I go back to this movie, I just don't really get that much enjoyment out of it. It is silly, it's kind of simple fun, but it's not really my kind of Bond movie, I have to admit, so that's why it falls into 19th place. So in 18th place, I'm going to go with 2008's Quantum of Solace, the second movie to star Daniel Craig. Now, a few years ago, this movie would have fallen last in my rankings. It used to be my least favourite Bond movie. Over time, I have grown to appreciate it a little bit more. However, I still don't think it's a great movie. For me, the problem with this movie is that it just feels like a sort of an extended epilogue to Casino Royale. It doesn't really feel like its own movie, but I do like parts of it. I think the action sequences are very, very good, very exhilarating. It's got a very quick pace to it. And I actually quite like the fact that this movie is quite short in comparison to a lot of other Bond movies. You think of the likes of Casino Royale and Specter and No Time to Die, which are like, 2.5 hours long, whereas this movie is a very quick 100 minutes. And I know some people have complaints for that, but at the same time, I kind of like it. I like the sort of the fast pace of this movie. But having said that, it just doesn't really feel like its own Bond movie, and we also have a pretty weak villain and a weak storyline, which doesn't help either. It's not a bad movie, but it's just not a great one, and like I said, it just doesn't feel like its own complete Bond movie, so for me it has to fall into 18th place. So in 17th place, I'm going to go with 1983's Octopussy, starring Roger Moore. Now, I know a lot of people that really enjoy this movie, and don't get me wrong, I do like aspects of it, but this movie has just a very, very strange clash of tones. You've got some very dark, violent, serious moments, and then you've got some really silly moments, and the movie just can't like combine the two of them together well. I really enjoy some of the action sequences. I think the train sequence is great. I love the pre-title sequence. I love the scene after with 009 in the clown costume. I think that scene is very dark, and it used to scare the hell out of me when I was younger. But at the same time, I just don't like the more silly side to this movie. The Tarzan swing, the gorilla suit, the clown suit with Bond. I don't think the villain is anything special. I find him very forgettable. I find a lot of the locations just a bit boring, and worst of all, the plot to this movie is just so convoluted. Like if you asked me to describe the plot of this movie to you, I would not be able to. It goes from one place to the other, and Bond is suddenly after this and this and this, and it just becomes so convoluted. And yeah, that's why I really struggle with this movie, not to mention some of the more sillier aspects to it. But like I said, there are moments I like, but there are also a lot of moments that I dislike. So in 16th place, I'm going to go with 1997's Tomorrow Never Dies. Sadly, another movie starring Pierce Brosnan falls into the latter half of the rankings for me. And don't get me wrong, I do like aspects of this movie, but there's a lot that I don't. I mean, first of all, I love the pre-title sequence. I love a lot of the action scenes. I love the scene with the BMW, the scene at the print works, the scene at Elliot Carver's event, is it, near the beginning of the movie. But for whatever reason, when this movie goes into the second half and the action moves to Vietnam, I think it is, for whatever reason, I just totally lose interest in the movie, and yeah, I really struggle to get towards the end. I don't find the plot all that engaging. I don't like the villain. I don't really find any of the side characters that interesting. The only thing I really do like about this movie is Pierce Brosnan as Bond and some of the action sequences. Don't get me wrong, it's not a bad movie, but I don't think it's a great one either, and yeah, for that reason, it falls into 16th place for me. So in 15th place, this is going to be probably a very, very controversial one for a lot of people. However, I do know that some people will agree with me. I'm going to give a shout out to JT at the Movies, because I know he shares a very similar opinion that I do about this movie. And JT also did his own ranking on the James Bond franchise, so if you want to check that out, I will leave a link to his ranking in the description below. But anyway, the movie is Goldfinger. Now, I know this movie is considered a classic. I know it set the template for future Bond movies. It was the first one to include all the gadgets, the classic car, the larger-than-life villain, and just a lot of other sort of, hallmarks that we would get in future Bond movies. But for whatever reason, whenever I watch this movie, I just find it a bit of a struggle. I don't find it that engaging. The plot, it doesn't have that it doesn't have those personal stakes that maybe it does in other Bond movies, and I just don't find it that exciting. I definitely respect and appreciate the movie for what it did for the franchise, but as a movie on its own, I really don't get all that much enjoyment out of it, I'm really sorry to say. So that is why Goldfinger only falls into 15th place for me. So in 14th place, I'm going to go with 2012's Skyfall, starring Daniel Craig. Now, this is a movie that when I first saw it, I remember seeing it at the cinema. When I came out the cinema, I loved it. And up until that point, it was my favourite Daniel Craig movie. But obviously my opinions have changed since then. When I watch this movie now, I find it a bit of a struggle. I find it takes a very long time to get going. It's a bit too somber in tone, and it's almost a bit boring in places. It doesn't really get going until probably the last quarter when the main villain gets introduced. But up until then, I do find it just a bit too slow for me. Also, it doesn't really feel like a classic Bond movie. Again, I'm going to give a shout out to JT at the Movies, because I think he best described this movie as being a good movie, but not a good Bond movie, and I would have to agree. It feels more along the lines of The Dark Knight or something by Christopher Nolan, which, when this movie came out, those movies were very big, so I can understand them trying to replicate that kind of formula. But yeah, it just doesn't feel like a Bond movie, and I just find it a bit too dark, a bit too slow moving for me. But I know this movie does have a lot of fans, and it does of course have that great theme from Adele. But other than that, I think the movie's fine, but it's not one I really enjoy going back to, so that's why it falls into 14th place. Right, so from here on in, the rankings get a bit more difficult because from this point, I do enjoy pretty much all of these movies, and it was quite tricky to place the movies in, their respective places. But anyway, in 13th place, I'm going to go with Thunderball, starring Sean Connery. So this is a classic example of a movie that I really didn't like as a kid. I found this movie a bit too long. Again, I remember it used to take forever to get going. There's all those scenes where Bond is kind of like recuperating at that, it's like that spa, and I always remember as a kid that whole sequence just seemed to go on forever, and it never felt like the movie, the main plot was established until about the 45-minute to an hour mark. Having said that, this is one of those movies that's really grown with me. every time I watch it. And I really like a lot of aspects of it. It has that sort of classic espionage feel to it, you know, with sort of the sequences with the pilot being killed and being replaced by a duplicate. I think all of that is really cool. And I think the villain is pretty decent. I don't think he's one of the greatest villains, but I think he's a fairly solid villain, and a lot of his side villains are all really good. I think Sean Connery is probably at his peak here with his performance as James Bond. And I think the Bond girls, the locations, they're all really good. I don't think it's one of my all-time favorites, but it is one that I do enjoy going back to. And yeah, I do enjoy Thunderball, even though when I was younger I never used to. It's definitely one that has grown for me, but it still falls into 13th place. So in 12th place, I'm going to go with 1977's The Spy Who Loved Me, starring Roger Moore. So I know this movie is another favourite for a lot of Bond fans. I know it's considered one of the best along with Goldfinger. I do really enjoy this movie, don't get me wrong. I don't think it's one of the best, but I do think it's a very solid adventure. I think Roger Moore has finally come into his own as Bond. I think the Bond girl, Triple X, is great. It's obviously got Jaws, a classic Bond villain. Here he's played more as a serious, threatening villain, less comedic, as we would see in his next movie. I think the weakest aspect for me with this movie is the villain, and that is Stromberg. I kind of just feel like they were just trying to do a Blofeld clone when they wrote Stromberg, and I just don't find him very interesting or very threatening. I feel like he never stands up. I feel like he's always sat behind a chair whenever we see him on screen, whenever he's talking to Bond. He just doesn't really have that presence, that threatening presence we want from a Bond villain. But other than that, it is a lot of fun. Like I said, all the characters are great, bar Stromberg. I really like the theme tune by Carly Simon, one of the best for sure. And yeah, there's a lot of fun moments in it. It's not one of my personal favourites, but it is a very, very strong Bond movie, but it falls into 12th place. So in 11th place, I'm going to go with 1979's Moonraker. Now, again, I know a lot of people will probably be thinking this is quite a controversial choice, especially putting it higher than The Spy Who Loved Me, but I find these movies, like Moonraker and The Spy Who Loved Me, I find them both very, very similar in plot and with the villain. But I have always enjoyed Moonraker just that little bit more. What I like about this movie is it's just a lot of fun. I loved it as a kid, and it's one of those classic Bond movies that you can just put on like a Sunday afternoon, just turn your brain off and have a lot of fun with it. I know some people don't like it because it's Bond in space, but for me, it's not really Bond in space. Yes, he is in space for the last 20-25 minutes, but up until that point, it's just your classic Bond adventure. And I love all the locations in this movie. I feel like Moonraker might be the most that Bond travels. I feel like we see him in so many different countries. You know, he's in England, then he's in California. I know they filmed it in France, but it's meant to be California. Then he's in Venice, then he's in Brazil, and, you know, like the South American jungles. I just feel like he goes all over the world in this movie, so it kind of keeps it fresh, and I really enjoy that aspect for it. I love a lot of the stunts in it. I think the pre-title sequence, that free-falling sequence from the plane is stunning, and just, I don't know how they shot that back in 1978 or 79, but it looks amazing, and it's just so much fun. We also have a villain who I think is pretty good. We have Drax. I know he's very similar to Stromberg, but I do feel like he has more presence and he feels more of a threatening villain than Stromberg. But then at the same time, we have Jaws, but you know, he's not as threatening in this movie. He's played more for laughs, but it's still good to see him back in the movie. And yeah, I know this movie does have its faults, but I just have a lot of fun with it every time I watch it. So that's why it falls into 11th place. Right, we're into the top 10 now, and in 10th place, I'm going to go with Casino Royale, starring Daniel Craig. Now, I've had a very interesting history with this movie, because when I first saw it, I did not like it whatsoever. I wanted a classic Bond adventure. I didn't want a gritty, serious origin story. I just wanted your classic Bond adventure that got straight into the action. So for a long time, I really dismissed this film and didn't really give it a chance. But over time, I have grown to really like this movie. I do still think it is a bit too long. I do find the ending is dragged out way too much, but pretty much everything else is great. I love the villain with Mads Mikkelsen. Daniel Craig is great. The action sequences are really exhilarating, really brutal in places. You've got obviously the classic poker scene, which is just very, very tense, very exciting stuff. There's just a lot of really great moments in it, and other than the length and that sort of that ending, which just does go on a bit too long for me, other than that, I think it's a really solid movie, and that's why it falls into 10th place. So in 9th place, I'm going to go with 1985's A View to a Kill. Again, another choice which I know is going to be controversial, but I'm just going to say it. I have a lot of fun with this movie. I will say that yes, Roger Moore is way too old. He is well past it in this movie. He is very, very long in the tooth. He's not convincing in the role anymore. I feel like his stuntmen appear more as Bond in the movie than he does. But that aside, I just really enjoy this movie. It's very, very fun. There's some great action sequences. We've got great villains, a great theme tune by Duran Duran. And I like the sort of the darker, serious, more violent side that this movie has. It kind of feels more like a Timothy Dalton Bond movie, maybe with some of the silliness aside, but on the whole, it feels more like this movie could have been more suited for Timothy Dalton. But yeah, I just really enjoy it. I have a blast with it. And other than Roger Moore being too old for the role, I don't really have any other criticisms for it. But yeah, there you go. That is A View to a Kill in 9th place. So in 8th place, I'm going to go with the one that started it all, and that is 1962's Dr. No. And yeah, I just have so much nostalgia for this movie. Again, it was probably one of the first Bond movies I ever saw as a kid. I think this movie is really, really good, and I know it is kind of hampered by budget limitations, but I just find the mystery and the story in this one really engaging. I like the fact that, you know, the villain, Dr. No, you don't really see him to the end until the end of the movie, and for most part, he's kind of a mystery. And I find that aspect really engaging. Certainly as a kid, I found it engaging, but even now I still do. Sean Connery's great in it. Obviously, it's his first role. He's young, he's fresh, he's fit, and, you know, he just he has a good time with the role. I like a lot of the side characters. I like the Jamaican locations. I just really enjoy this movie, and I know that, you know, it's not like aesthetically the best looking Bond movie in terms of the sets, and obviously the budget didn't really help with that. But other than that, I just think the story is really, really solid, really engaging, and it's still one of my favourite Bond movies to this day, so that is Dr. No in 8th place. So in 7th place, I'm going to go with 1973's Live and Let Die, the first Bond movie to star Roger Moore. And I don't know what it is about this movie, but I just love it. I think, again, I have a lot of nostalgia for it. I can remember watching it as a kid and really enjoying it, and to this day, I still do. But I can understand criticisms of it. I know, similar to Man with the Golden Gun, it can feel a bit slow and a bit bland in places, but I don't know, like, I just really enjoy the story with this one. I like the Bond girl. I think Jane Seymour's great. I like the villain with Kananga, and I really enjoy some of the action sequences. I think the boat chase sequence in, is it Louisiana? It's just a fantastic boat chase, and it goes on for quite a while, and it just doesn't let up, and I find that sequence so much fun. But there's also other sequences with the bus chase scene, the ending on the train, the scene with the crocodiles where Bond has to run across them. There's just so many great moments in it that I just have a lot of fun with. And yeah, I know it's probably not considered one of the greatest Bond movies, but for me, it's always going to have a special place in my heart, and that's why it falls into 7th place. So in 6th place, I'm going to go with 1995's GoldenEye, the first movie to star Pierce Brosnan. Now, I know I said before that most of Pierce Brosnan's movies fall into the latter part for me, but this one is definitely, for me, one of the best Bond movies, and it's just a fantastic movie. The direction is so slick. The action sequences are exhilarating, they're exciting, the villains are great, and Pierce Brosnan, even though it's his first movie, he fits into the role so easily, and you wouldn't think it's his first movie. It is so much fun, this film, and again, I'm going to put it down to nostalgia. It was definitely one of the first I saw because I remember I had the Nintendo 64 video game as a kid. So whenever I think of the movie, I always think of the game, or when I think of the game, I always think of the movie. So it's kind of a combination of nostalgia, but also, general love for this movie. I do think it is fantastic and just an exhilarating, exciting Bond adventure. So that is why GoldenEye falls into 6th place. Right, so we're into the top 5 now, and in 5th place I'm going to go with 1981's For Your Eyes Only, starring Roger Moore. And yeah, I know this movie is not considered one of the best amongst fans, but for me, I love this movie. I like the more sort of espionage tale that this movie has, like the story of Bond trying to retrieve the Lecter. I think the action sequences are fun, the stunts are incredible, you've got the skiing sequence, you've got the rock climbing sequence at the end. There's some really incredible stuff on show here, and I just like the more serious tone that this movie takes, certainly after Moonraker, which was the previous movie, where that movie took Bond into space, but For Your Eyes Only brings Bond right back down to earth with a very, very subtle, serious movie where he kind of has to rely more on his wits than his gadgets. And I just really enjoy it. And for all its faults, I still love it. And it will never really fall further down in the rankings for me. It's always going to be right up there. I just think it's a fantastic movie. I can't say much more than that. That is For Your Eyes Only in 5th place. Right, so into 4th place now, and I'm going to go with 1987's The Living Daylights, the first James Bond movie to star Timothy Dalton in the role. Now, the first thing I'm going to say about this movie, the first positive thing I'm going to say about it is Timothy Dalton. He is my all-time favourite James Bond actor. I just think he's a brilliant actor in general, but he's very convincing in the role. He's great with the stunts, great with the action, and just in general, a fantastic James Bond. But other than that, there's a great serious tone to this movie, like For Your Eyes Only. It's more down to earth. The stunts are great. The action's great. The Bond girl, played by Mariam Darbo, is great. She's a really sweet character. There's a lot I really love about this movie. I will say that this movie does have kind of weakish villains. They probably are some of the worst villains in the entire franchise, and I do think the last act of the movie is not as strong as the first two, but I'm not going to dwell on that too much because I think on the whole this movie is fantastic and I really enjoy it every time I watch it. It's not my favourite Timothy Dalton Bond movie, we will come to that shortly, but this is still a fantastic James Bond and it falls into 4th place. Right, so into 3rd place now, and I'm going to go with 1969's On Her Majesty's Secret Service, the one and only Bond movie to star George Lazenby in the role. And yeah, this is another movie. This is a classic example of a movie that I just did not like at all as a kid. Even so much that when I used to have a marathon of James Bond movies, there were times where I used to skip this movie outright and I used to just completely dismiss it. But over time, this movie has really grown on me, and every time I watch it, it continues to grow. I think this is a fantastic movie. I know George Lazenby is considered the weakest aspect of it. I don't think he's that bad. Obviously, his acting skills are a bit suspect, but I think on the whole, he's very convincing in the role. He looks the part. He's really good with the action, the stunts, and I don't think he is as bad as people make out to be. I really like the location with this one. Obviously, a lot of it takes place in Switzerland during the winter. And if you haven't guessed already, I do like a lot of skiing sequences in James Bond movies, and this one just has them in abundance. But again, like the likes of Living Daylights and For Your Eyes Only, this is more of a serious espionage kind of Bond movie, with Bond having to rely on his wits. We have a great Blofeld here with Telly Savalas playing the role, and for me, he's probably the most underrated actor to play Blofeld. I like the fact that Blofeld gets more involved in a lot of the physical side. I know Donald Pleasance is often considered the most famous Blofeld, but I do feel with him, he spends most of his time sitting behind a chair, whereas Telly Savalas actually gets involved with a lot of the physical stuff. And then on top of that, we have, a great romance story and just a amazing ending. Well, I say amazing, a very tragic ending, but you know, every time I watch it, you know, still to this day, it's such a heartbreaking ending to a Bond movie, and I don't think any Bond movie will ever top it in terms of endings. It's incredible, really. And yeah, I really love this movie, and like I said, it just grows in stature every time I watch it. But at the moment, it falls into third place. Right, so into second place now, and I'm gonna go with 1963's From Russia with Love, the second Bond movie and the second to star Sean Connery in the role. And yeah, this movie has always been a favourite of mine. Even when I was a young kid, I always used to find this movie so exciting, so engrossing. Again, I love the more sort of serious tone to this movie. I like the fact that Bond has to rely more on his wits, at least to an extent, briefcase aside. But yeah, I just love the sort of the whole plot of him having to go into this sort of unknown land to retrieve this device and then return back to England safe. But obviously he has all these villains on his tail. It's a really tense and exciting Bond movie. I love the sort of espionage feel to it. It feels the most like a classic Cold War spy thriller. I really, really like that aspect to it. And yeah, I just think Sean Connery is on his A game here. He's fantastic, and the villains are great, and it's just a really tense, exciting movie. And the second half of the movie, especially when they get on the train and they're trying to make their way back to England, and they've got the villains on their tail, it's just real tense stuff. And all the way to the end, it's just one thing after another. And yeah, I just have a fantastic time with this movie every time I watch it. But yeah, that is From Russia with Love in second place. Right guys, so we're into first place, and for anyone who knows me, they will know exactly what movie is coming up. This movie is not only my favourite James Bond movie, it's one of my all-time favourite movies in general, and it is of course 1989's Licence to Kill, starring Timothy Dalton in his second and last appearance as James Bond. And yeah, where do I start with this movie? I could be here for hours telling you why I love it, but I will try and be as quick as possible. Again, we have Timothy Dalton in the role. He's fantastic in this movie. He's great with the acting, the action scenes, the stunt work. The movie just feels more tailored to him as opposed to Living Daylights. He's brilliant in the movie. We also have a fantastic villain played by Robert Davi, playing the character of Sanchez. He is just an absolutely terrifying villain, and you really worry for Bond every time he comes within sort of a close vicinity of him. You know, there's also great henchmen in there. You've got Benicio del Toro. The Bond girls are great. They're not just there to stand and look pretty. They actually get involved and they do stuff, and they're brilliant in it. The story is just more personal and more simple. And, you know, we're not watching another Octopussy with a convoluted plot. We're watching a very simple revenge story. And I know some people don't like that aspect and they don't think it belongs in Bond. But for me, I really like it, and I like the more personal side the story takes. And above all that, just the action sequences in this movie, some of the very best stunt work in all of James Bond history is on show in this movie. You've got the tanker chase sequence at the end of the movie. You've got the water skiing sequence. You've got the scene with the helicopter and the plane at the beginning. You've got the bar fight. You've just got so many incredible action scenes in this movie, and it's just so much fun from start to finish. I know it is kind of dark and violent, and it probably is the most violent Bond movie, but I've always liked it. Even since I was a kid, when I was probably too young to watch it, I've always had a great time with this movie, and I never get sick and tired of it. I love this movie, and it will probably always be my all-time favourite Bond movie. So yeah, Licence to Kill falls into first place. So there you go, guys. That is my ranking for the official 25 James Bond movies. Really hope you've enjoyed this video, guys. Let me know in the comments below if you're a James Bond fan. What are some of your favourites? What are your least favourites? Do you have a ranking of your own? I would love to hear your thoughts. So yeah, just let me know in the comments. But until then, I will leave the video here. So thanks again for watching, guys, and take care.